We're beginning our stencil project, and this is going to be the only project that you're required to have an addition of mostly identical prints. And I say that because in hand printing, it's far less likely that you're going to be able to get perfectly identical prints as you could if you were using a press, which is going to regularize things and make it to where there's highly predictable printing processes. But it is going to make you good at the method, that's for sure. So we've got to have a minimum of 4 identical prints for this. And you'll be using 4 stencils, right? So I have an example of one of my stencils here. I printed it maybe 3 or 4 times. You can see it's covered in paint right now. So underneath, I've got a white piece of paper so that you can kind of see what the difference is between these colors and the openings, right? So when you're thinking about a stencil, okay, you're thinking about the areas that you cut away that's going to allow paint to pass through here, either by push swab brush or by spray paint or airbrush or some other means of getting ink or paint through the stencil, right? So a couple of things about that. We're working with just like a heavier kind of a tag board, right? It's like a poster board. So you wouldn't want to do this with just like, you know, bond paper or anything. You need something with some constitution to it, something that can hold its strength. But it's also not like the kind of drawing that you could do where there's a lot of gradation and fading happening. It's not that you can't do that, you certainly can, but you have to follow some procedures to keep your stencil designed and organized so that it all stays together, right? So in order for me to have all these lines in here that sort of describe the neck and how that sternocleidomastoid comes up into sort of this under neck area, I had to be selective about where I cut these spots open. So I made sure that I had what are called bridges connecting different areas through. So like I made a little tiny cut here, I had a cut next to that and a bigger cut here. I wanted somewhat of a gradation to happen here, okay? But it can't be like pencil shading. It's more like pen and ink shading, it's very absolute. So I had to make sure that I had like little connections in between each of those. So the difficulty comes in describing your information with the right amount of information. Like you don't need every little mark to describe the information that you're trying to make, right? The minimal amount might not look very good either. So you've got to strike that right balance. The human mind can put these marks together and make sense and understand what's being described in here, right? Because I knew I wanted more darkness underneath sort of this cranium area, I made sure that my cuts got larger, and I put some cuts in between some of those so that I could keep a continuous channel of bridges moving in and through here. One thing that I'll be working with you on throughout this project is identifying islands, right? So an island, this is a really good example if you can zoom in. This is an island where you have an area that's not supposed to hold any information, right? It's a stop out, but I can't just have it in there by itself. I have to connect it with a bridge. So think about it like geographically, right? Islands stuck out in the ocean are never going to stay with the landmass, so to speak, that our stencil holds together. So these are all bridges that help us connect to that. I actually had a bridge here at one time, and just through repeated use of this stencil, this tiny little connection has broken down and cut. I'll use this stencil several more times, but I guarantee that this is going to break down, probably rip off at some point. I was trying to be a lot more descriptive in these areas too. So I ended up making a lot smaller cuts. Again, some areas like this, where I have an extremely delicate bridge coming out to those islands, I'm probably going to lose those over time. And because you have to use this repeatedly, it's important to think about the strength of your compositional matrix in here, right? While we're talking about matrix, anything in printmaking involves either a matrix or not. And a matrix is simply a determining factor with a plate or with some kind of substrate, something we print off of, that makes it to where there's a reliable image that comes off of that. Something that doesn't have a matrix is completely wide open. However you treat that is decisions that you make, right? You can create any kind of image off of a no matrix plate. So this is definitely a matrix type situation. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of different ways of taking our information and getting it onto our key plate. Now the key plate And again, I know it's not a plate, it's a stencil, but it's just something we refer to in printmaking all the time. Our key plate is typically black or your darkest color, okay? And it carries the bulk of the information. And when I say the bulk of the information, I mean the most descriptive aspects of that information, meaning like the shading, the contours, those sorts of things, right? A lot of times your supporting plates are either just flat colors, or they're the kind of thing that maybe create some less dominant information in a lighter color than black or a dark blue or something like that. Or sometimes they add texture, right? So we need four total plates, okay? Because we're gonna do this CMYK, we're gonna do a yellow, a red, a blue, and a black. Doesn't mean that you can't deviate from that if your plan chooses or forces you to do that. You certainly can, but our first print is gonna be yellow, red, blue, and black, so you get a good idea about how those things work together in combination. Okay, so what I've got here, I've got some information that I printed off. I originally had this composition here, just kind of like a loose composition. Obviously not everything's worked out yet, but you're gonna be required to use a mixture of hand-drawn elements, like I drew this in pencil from, I think it's a CPR dummy that I have at home, and some photographic and or photo collage type elements. Now, you know, I'm not gonna be really dictatorial about this. If you want to treat it more with your hand and do it all with hand-drawn, that's great. I'm perfectly happy with that. But I'm saying that, you know, that's an allowance that you're more than welcome to pursue. So in addition to that, I've got this chrysanthemum that I drew a couple of years ago, and I etched it into a copper plate. So I took an old proof of that and I collaged that onto this plate, or onto this composition. You probably saw this one earlier, right? This is an image I've been working with for a long time, and yeah, I appropriated this from a really old Grey's Anatomy. I really like the formal qualities of that. But then I've got a lot of hand-drawn elements up in here in pen, and then I've got this sort of dome from some basilica somewhere, right? So these are gonna be really good for me to show you different techniques for this. And so what I'm gonna do is actually treat a few of these in isolation. So what I did was I took my chrysanthemum and I put it on the copy machine and I enlarged it, I think like 200%, so that it's a larger image. Like something that small is not gonna work very well with stenciling, okay? I need to be able to have room to actually construct my bridges and islands in adequate channels. This is a highly detailed photograph here, and I think it's a really good demonstrable element to show, because there's no way I can create a stencil that's gonna be this detailed. So in a situation like this, I have to start making intellectual decisions about how much information I need to convey this information to the viewer, and how much I don't need, right? Like what's the absolute gestalt, the minimum that a human being would need in order to go, oh, okay, I see what you're saying there, right? So I'm gonna demonstrate with both images, and there's a variety of ways that we can take these images and get them onto your mat, not your mat board, but your tag board, poster board as it is. So you're gonna get a full sheet of poster board like this, okay? And what we're gonna do is we're gonna quarter it. And the reason we wanna do that is because we want them all to be the same size. It's actually really important that all of your plates are the same size for registration purposes. Now there are benefits and there are detriments to each of these transfer processes for getting these on to onto our plate surface or our substrate, the tag board, as it were. And I'll talk about that as I'm going along. So I do want these the same size, right? But if they deviate just a little bit, like you can see mine is, okay? That's not a huge deal because we're not using the outside of our of our tag board as the registration element. We actually have to cut registration holes into these that we can line up, okay? So what I'm gonna do for my key plate, I'm just gonna set the others aside for now. I'm gonna establish a border, okay? So this border is really important in determining what my, let's see here, there we go. And what my paper size would be, where my registration marks are gonna be. And just for the sake of brevity here, I'm just gonna use the width of the ruler from the outside. And what I wanna do is keep all my information within this border, because this is gonna be the thing that holds everything together on the outside. Okay. So what I may want to dictate here is like what the top is versus the bottom, just so I kind of have a good understanding of that when I'm printing. Now within these 4 areas in the corners, that's where I'm going to put my my registration holes, right? Because we need these completely out of the picture. We don't want to see the registration holes on your final print. This should be an area where like a mat would cover it up, right? So I strongly advise you to use a ruler for this. I've had some students that are like, well, I can cut a pretty good shape. And then, yeah, things get off just a little bit. You really need to use a rectilinear shape of some kind. I like triangles. It just seems to work the best for me. Do not use a circle or an oval. Those are too hard to match up. Sometimes a square can be difficult too. I just like triangles just because I only have to cut 3 sides, right? And I've got 3 peaks on there that I can compare to one another. Now I've got to have a minimum of 3 registration marks on here. If you only did 2, you could line that up okay, but if something happens up here, right, it's going to throw your print off. It's not going to be registered. Some people that get really, really strict and critical about this will go with 4, right? It's up to you. I think what I'm going to do in this case is just go with a 3rd one up in here. Because chances are that if I use 3, I'm going to be a lot more accurate than 2. And 1 would never work because you're going to have all kinds of misregistration issues there. Okay. Now when I cut these out, I'm going to try to stay inside of my line so I can still see them. Just so I know that's sort of a litmus for the others. And I'm not going to cut the others just yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer these to the other stencils once I have my key stencil worked out. It's important that you're working on a good, clean cutting mat for all this, right? Make sure you don't have any like detritus or trash or spray adhesive, any nasty on there. We need a nice clean cutting mat. You need nice sharp blades as well. You'll be changing your blades quite a bit throughout this. It's a painstaking process, that's for sure. There's some printmakers that will use these holes also, like as a pin system, and you can slide it on there and let it drop down instead of using spray adhesive. I like to use spray adhesive. It just seems like it works better. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I am going to transfer. I'm going to transfer these in different methods, right? So first week, what we did was we did the toner transfer, right? So we can take a print of this and like literally print it on here, okay? What's nice about that is that you're taking the toner from this, putting it straight directly on here. It'll be a little bit lighter than this, and so you can go in there and draw over the top, and you can edit it quite a bit, right? The other method that I use a lot is to cut out the selected imagery that you want to create a stencil of. Either put spray adhesive on the back or use a good deal of glue stick on the back and stick it down super well, because we don't want that paper flapping up necessarily. Now the challenge with that particular situation is that you have to cut through this paper and this, right? Sometimes that makes for like a lack of clarity, meaning that you might think that you've cut through like the top layer, but not totally through the bottom layer. And so you might think it's good to go, and then you like rip it off and it's not. Another thing too is just like the whole process of working with your stencils repeatedly. That paper's gonna absorb paint. It's gonna make it a little bit different than the way that your tag board's gonna absorb paint. So that may be the least precise method or the least favorable method, pretty precise, but you could always go with the tried and true light box situation. Put the imagery on here, right? Put it on a light box, trace all of the information that you need in there. That way you don't have multiple layers on here, right? So I guess just for the sake of doing this demo rather quickly, I'm gonna go ahead and just use the glue stick to get this on here. But first I'm gonna go ahead and do my toner transfer. So when you do the toner transfer, it's really smart to wear gloves, because we don't want that toner up in our blood system any more than we have to have it in our blood system. Now it is gonna reverse the image, right? So if for some reason your imagery contains text or symbols and that's important to you to maintain, you might wanna reverse that first on your photocopy so that it reverses again when it comes back here. To make this a little more simple for me to compose, I'm gonna make this a little bit more regular. Now you should keep all of your information within that border, right? Again, that border is what we use to protect the edges of our paper. So hard to pull this off. There we go. Gloves on. So remember, we want a tape hinge there. Okay, so a few reminders about the acetone transfer, right? Acetone can make it really nasty up in here. So we just use a little bit at a time. A little tiny bit at a time. We only transfer a little bit at a time. We'll probably also need to open the windows, as it were. We want to check repeatedly, right, to make sure that we got the right thing going. And again, sort of a reminder on toner transfer, we want to move quickly. Toner evaporates fast. If you were doing this at home, I'd recommend that you do this outside on a not windy day in Kansas, which is very difficult to find. I'm just about there. All right, that works out. Let's see here. I need a little bit more information out here. I don't think I need to get more toner to do that. I think I have enough in my shop towel. I was getting nervous when I'm doing a toner transfer because I'm like, how much am I breathing in? How much am I contaminating myself? Gotta go fast. Oh, that's better. Okay, I like that pretty well. So I'm gonna carefully pull my tape up because I don't want it to mess up my matrix, because it will take a little bit of that with it. Okay, now I'm gonna get rid of this just because it's got a bunch of toner on it. I don't wanna be breathing that. Okay. So what I'm gonna do with this, I think I wanna juxtapose that up in here. Yeah. I like that pretty well. Okay. Just gonna lay this on the top. Give myself a good idea about how I wanna compose that. I kinda want it coming into the composition. Getting really close to that cathedral. Just make a mark on there. Give me a rough idea about where to cut that. Yeah, I kind of like that kind of awkward closeness there. Match up those marks. Again, I'm designing inside of my print border. Now, for the sake of not having to use so much of this, I'm actually going to trim in and around my information really close, because I don't need all that extra paper on there, especially when it's gonna obfuscate my cathedral. Okay. I'm going to use a copious amount of glue because I don't want this thing going anywhere. Make sure you go completely off the edges of it. You know, as you're composing, you may decide that you like this method, this sort of collage-y type method. Go for it, you know. You'll find the pitfalls, you'll discover it. And it may work for you. How about like this, didn't I? Yes. Okay, so now it's time for me to determine what I need to cut out for my key information. How much of this information do I need versus how much do I not need, right? So this is when I kind of sit down with the Sharpie. And I always like to keep my original around for this. Just so that I can kind of look at some of the darks and lights. I feel like I need to establish this first, because this stuff here, I kind of have a pretty straight away idea what I'm going to cut. I've got a lot of shading in here, right? Stippling, some tiny little marks. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to get all of that stuff, but I at least know where to start with most of the areas that I can cut out in terms of the dark spots. Now, I'm going to have to do a lot of like determination of bridges and islands, especially in here, where these little islands are not going to be able to hold themselves very well. So I'm going to, well, at all. So I'm going to have to be selective about what I cut out of here. But the first thing I'm going to do with this thing is go, okay, what can I feasibly cut out and still maintain some semblance? Like there's no way whatsoever I'm going to be able to get all these little kind of shingly type things. But these things here, I can definitely get involved. I'm going to have to simplify some of the stuff happening up in here. So I think that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to blacken in pretty carefully. So I'm using one of these retractable Sharpies that are awesome. Seems like they don't dry out like the other fine tip ones. So I'm trying to be mindful about leaving some channels in there as I draw. So like in some cases I won't probably fill in the whole thing. Looks like there's kind of a diagonal structure happening here. I don't know that I'll get the whole thing, but I'm going to focus on a few contours. Maybe a little bit here. Some smaller elements in here. It's kind of darker on this side because remember it reversed. The shadowing on my original is on the right side. The shadowing on this one's on the left side, so I'm going to try to stay faithful to that. So instead of like drawing all the black marks up in here, I'm just drawing the significant ones. Because what would happen if I were to cut like a perfect contour out of this whole thing, right? Just a black contour. The whole thing would just fall out. So I can't do the whole contour. I have to make some skips in here. But like in this case of this kind of architectural thing happening across the top, I could probably get away with cutting the whole thing out. But I can't keep all the little highlights in there. I don't need to. It just needs to read like a separation between one level to the next. Again, instead of doing the whole contour, I stop early, right? Instead of doing the whole circle, I leave a little bit out over here. The eye can fill in the rest. I'm just kind of selecting some areas that suggest to me that they ought to have some darkness. One thing I know I'm going to struggle with here is trying to get some of this in here to like logically show that kind of cone type shape. So that's when I'm going to have to use a little bit of my intuition, right? I'm going to have to probably like make a line, almost like a cross contour type line that describes that, but I can't do it the whole way around, right? I've got to suggest it in areas. Like that's probably going to work. This area, I might not cut completely out because it probably needs a better bridge. And like here, I'm just going to have a little mention of that area. Now this other stuff is going to be a lot easier because it's not so delicate. I'm just kind of the philosophy of trying to get the hard stuff done first. Like when I'm drawing a portrait, I really love to draw eyes. Don't start with the eyes, because then the rest of it feels like work. Save those eyes for like a reward, right? So here I think what I can do is I give myself a nice big slice that's open. But I can't do that the whole way, right? So I've got to choose some kind of a logical point at which it would be lighter. So when I'm looking at this, it's really dark down here. It's kind of lighter up in here. So I might like allow some bridge work to come through there. This is where I switch to a more efficient Sharpie. There's sort of a separation happening right here. A lot of times I'll just kind of try shading. and going, okay, well, is that going to work, right? Like, I know that's not going to work, so I'll probably just shade that in. I think I stop a little bit early right there. I think I'll bring another hatch mark up in here. I'm basically going to create kind of like a wandering bridge through here, so it doesn't look like a straight connection, because then it's obvious that I'm creating a bridge, right? So I'm kind of trying to create somewhat of a harmonious break-up of the black and white. So I'll probably bring this into this area significantly here. I mean, some people, and it depends on the imagery, right? So like, if you're working with some highly mechanical imagery and it makes sense to go with the straight bridge through there, then do it. Absolutely. But here I think this is going to be enough information to say, hey, it's a little lighter here, but also it's going to allow for the structure to come through. So one thing I am going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of a contour on the outside, but again, it can't be a perfect contour. So here I am stopping early here, I'm stopping early here, right? Again, the human eye can connect those. It's an implied line, more or less. Do the same thing down here. Right? So again, this is a connection. We can see that, not a problem. But then since I stopped early there, I might come in here and just do a little bit more shading. And then because I need a connection through here somehow, I think I'm going to leave this open. I'll describe like a little architectural jutting out of sorts right here. And then I'll allow another connection to the outside, another bridge inside to this island. And it kind of looks like there's some like shaded window structures in here, so I'm just going to kind of create a network of those coming across. And the nice thing about that is that it breaks it up, and because they're geometric, right, it naturally allows for like a network to come through there. And of course, my drawing's not perfect, but when I'm cutting, I'll try to perfect some things with a clean blade. I am going to cut this whole ellipse out though. Doesn't make sense to try to leave anything inside of their white. So in treating this ellipse, where I have a little bit more light coming in here, and same with this, again, simplification. I can use my other supporting plates to provide more information if I need. So I'm thinking very much all or nothing here. I'm thinking very much vector shape. Excuse me. We'll edit that belch out. Right. In theory, you could create some shading type mark, and you should try it, right? Let's see what you can get away with. Okay, so this other one that has a lot more description in here. Let's see. I think what I'm going to try to do is stay true to this shadow. Not going to worry about that detail, but then I'm just going to like repeat this on the outside of it, right? So to me, I can see that shadow's like in here. Go back and forth just to make sure, because I don't have a perfect transfer, but I don't need a perfect transfer. I can always consult my original. And then that other shadowed area is out here, so that's where I'm going to drop this in. I think for just a little bit more continuity in there, I'm going to come up here and add kind of like a broken secondary type shadow. That way I've got connections, right? Okay. Now this last one on the side that I really can't see much of. I'm just going to go with an open shape here to describe the top of the window. And then beneath that, I'm just going to give like a kind of an incomplete contour, like that. Just to hint that, right? Okay. So now I've got to make some decisions like across here. With this stuff, I'm probably going to treat it similarly to this, only I'm going to open it up and make it a little bit lighter. So it looks like there's kind of like a lighter area up in here. So I think what I'll do is I'll go again, this is kind of like the way I like to style things. You wouldn't necessarily have to. But these are the marks I enjoy making. The main thing is that I need to have this connected into this, right? So I'm going to go ahead and allow this to come back. Like kind of a jagged shadow coming across, or a jagged highlight rather. And again, like just because I'm making these choices now doesn't mean I can't deviate a little bit from this while I'm cutting. Sometimes I do that, sometimes it just, my thinking, oh, it was awesome one day. Next day I'm like, might be better like this. What if I try something like this, right? I will say that when you're working in Stencil, it's smart to try to use imagery that has a fair amount of recognizability on its own. Portraits seem to do well. I mean, the human brain can construct a portrait pretty easily, right? We've seen these kind of basilicas before, right? The human brain sees these structures all the time, so it doesn't need all that information. So I guess what I'm saying is abstract compositions don't do amazing with this because it's hard to articulate anything with that. But don't let that stop you, right? If that's your passion, go for it, man. Okay, so to make this edge a little bit lighter, I think I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to select another section that I want kind of like something of a highlight to come through. How do I want to do that? I think I want to keep something similar to what I've got above, so I'm just going to kind of start shading. Then I'll follow my shading marks. A lot of times I'll have like a little bit of white paint with me as well. Like if I look at it and I'm like, I don't like that. What happens if I like break this up with some white paint, right? So thinking about that sort of as an eraser as such. I'm just going to kind of be selective about how I go with this. Allow that to come down pretty far. So now based on the way I've shaded this, I'm going to go ahead and kind of create that vector, that shape. I'm going to allow that mark to come up quite a bit. I think I want this highlight less dynamic than the one on top because it's sort of coming down to a straighter aspect of the facade. So I kind of want it like a little less crazy. Sort of like a glimpse of a shimmer off of like some metal or something. Like what would that look like for just a second? Capture that in your brain. Okay. So that's probably going to provide me with enough to get across there. just so I don't get confused later, I'm going to blacken this in. So I am going to move across with this, right? Again, this is a reverse, and I kind of want to follow what I have here. So like in this one, I'm going to allow a lot more of these highlights to come through. And I'm just going to kind of take a cue from some of this stuff that's happening here, right? Like I should allow for some nice like open spaces in here. Before I move into that though, I want to resolve some areas down here just to kind of like give an illustration of how I'm going to deal with the overlapping here and how I'm going to deal with these window structures. Because if I cut them out like this, right, I couldn't keep any white inside. I'd cut those black out and then that white would just fall through, okay? So I've got to change my strategy just a little bit up in there. I'm going to start with this one because it's easiest to see. One thing I want to see pretty well is the contour around here. But again, I can't cut a black contour all the way around. Got to be selective with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, instead of these being white, I'm just going to dedicate some of them to being black and open. So this is kind of where you're thinking about some of those choices like that I made when I was talking about that very biological example, like where I wanted to kind of shade to openings. And so I really feel like all I need to do this is just the corners, you know? Because again, it's easy to put that together and see that that's a circle. So like I don't need this here, this here. I might give a suggestion of that down here, like what happens if I cut a little sliver right in here and just call that good. So instead of, once again, even trying to go for that conformity to the white in the middle, I'm just going to blacken them all out and let the network of the white around those black areas hold that together as a bridge. In fact, a lot of times these network situations, like honeycombs or like in this situation, almost kind of like a screen type texture, they can be pretty strong because there's so many connections and they're at very regular intervals. So we've kind of got to marry like the gestalt aspect of how much information do we need with the sturdiness of the construction of our printing matrix. So we've always got to be thinking about those two things as we're doing this. Now, honestly, I kind of like this look a little bit better anyway. Okay. So I'm going to talk briefly now about some of this overlapping stuff, and then I'll move into this just a little bit before I begin cutting. So I've got these other structures that are overlapping, right? So one of the areas that I know I can really create that illusion is going to be this area right here, because there's so much darkness. Like those are 8 and 9 values, even though these are pretty dark too. If I think in my mind that I can contrast this and like think of this as much lighter and this is like being completely black, I can easily show this in front of this. It gets a little dicier here where this is lighter. So I have to make some kind of different, some different decisions when it comes to that. So like for this one, I'm going to go in there and do something very similar to that I did with the windows, where I'm just going to select that open area. But again, I can't do it all the way around. It's going to fall out. So like in this case, I'm looking at that little white area, like, okay, well, that's a pretty good divider for me to connect that with this matrix. Okay. Now, I got a little spot down here that looks like it can kind of naturally use this suggestion in here. I'm just going to kind of follow that over for a little bit. I don't want to make it super delicate though, right? Another good spot for that is up in here. And I'm going to leave this area mostly alone because I don't want to lose the strength and integrity of that, right? Okay. So it looks like I can probably darken in a partial window around this to kind of help continue with that. Yeah. Continue with that. I wish I had some more information over here, but that's okay. I can manufacture some. Again, just sort of creating that psychic line here. And then when I get down here, I'm going to go ahead and define the edge with these islands in here, right? Okay, so I'd want to articulate some of this stuff in here so it doesn't just look like a blob, but I've got to be really cautious about that. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of follow the suggestion of these ridges, and I'm going to simplify the shape. So like over here, where it's really hard to see what's going on, because I have a very incomplete transfer, but I think I can see enough. I'm just going to follow some of those implied contours in here. I'm going to let it get skinnier as it goes up. I might make one mark there. Okay. So that would mean that I kind of have like a little ridge here. What's going to help that is if I have a straight line here. And it looks like that ridge is going to come up to the peak here, so I'm going to just come up and kind of describe that. Getting skinnier as I go up. I'm just kind of cross-hatching this for now, just because I'm more comfortable with that kind of marking. I'll come back later and probably make it more solid. Okay, it looks like I have one more to deal with. And that's way on the edge here. So that's like right here. So again, I can't take that all the way up. And I've established an order here to where it's like a shadow on this side of each one. So I need to kind of maintain that, right? Otherwise, it's going to look out of place. And if I wanted to, I could invent more ribs and stuff in here too to kind of get it more suggestive of some of the textures that are up in there. But it's such a small space that I'm not going to worry about that too much. Now, if I wanted to get texture up in here, I'd be really, I don't know, I'd be pushing it. Because this is just such a delicate area to try to cut anything into. But what I might do is I might create just a suggestion down here of where it terminates and the railing begins. But I can't take it all the way to the edge, right? So what I might do is just kind of like tiny little suggestion, like right there, just a little triangle. Just enough to see it, right? Okay. So I feel like that's probably gonna work. These others are gonna be a little bit more challenging, but I just have to reverse some of the contrast. Okay, I wanna talk a little bit about this before I just begin cutting. Of course, I'm gonna like draw everything out, but as enchanting as it is to watch me draw, it's probably better to see other problem-solving aspects. Okay, so if I want all these white, right, I've got to figure out how I can connect them. The first thing I'm seeing are areas where I have pieces touching. Those are going to be great areas for me to use as a bridge. And the nice thing about organic stuff like this flower is that you can make them look irregular and it's not going to look strange. So what I might do is just go in here and blacken some of the areas in between, but not all of them. And this is a point where I should probably, either have like a little bit of white paint or something to create those. So I'm going to get in here and do a little bit of bridge work just to make things easier on me. Let's see. So I have a connection here that's pretty significant, so I'm going to whiten that. I'm going to use this as a connection here, where those are touching, same here. And that means I'm going to have like a weird little irregular black spot up in there, which is good. It'll be fine. It'll create the information it needs and then hold the stencil together. any place I have just a simple contour, like where I was drawing, that's where I'm going to go ahead and create that connection. And like for you, you know, it may be easier for you to like actually go in and whiten these things out. But I've worked with this composition for a long time, so I'm pretty familiar with it. I'm not too worried about that. Yeah, this inside part is definitely going to be the highest challenge here. A little bit there. I'm going to connect that. I'm going to connect this. I like to start on the inside of problems like this and then work my way out, like a maze, so to speak. This looks like a really good way to get out of there. This looks like a really great way to get out of there. I always like to go with at least 2 connections too. If I can get away with it, 3 connections. So again, it's that marriage of not disrupting your imagery, but making a sturdy matrix. Okay. I'm gonna have to get creative with this one because it's really isolated, right? So in this case, I'm just gonna extend that flower petal over. I'm trying to use some of the same shape in there. And then I'll extend that flower petal this way as well. What's going to help here is to connect it right here as well. You kind of get that. That's going to make for a much sturdier matrix. Instead of it holding by 1, it's going to be held by 3. Again, all communicated all the way to the outside. This is kind of a big gap as well. Sometimes when I have something like that, I'll create a little information. Like I'll extend that petal just a touch and then connect. When I'm making these marks, right, I want it to agree with the information. Again, this is very organic, right? I don't want sharp marks. I want things to agree with the flower type aspect of what we're working with. Okay, so now I'm kind of getting to those petals that are starting to bloom out and less descriptive of the inside. What's nice about that is that they have a directional flow. So like where I have a petal like here that's sort of deviating, I can use the edge of that and connect it with one of these other irregular petals. I can bring this around like that. That's connected here. I think I'll connect that. Seems like this is a good connection here too. Good connection spot there. I think I really want to keep the integrity of the tip on this one. So instead of being conveniently like moving out like this, I think it makes more sense for me to maybe like pull this into this direction up in here and then maybe break it through the middle in this. Because I like that sensibility. Same thing here, right? Like I really want that to look like a petal. I don't want it to look like just a line that's coming out of here. So I'll try to connect it earlier. In the form, that is. And of course, my ultimate goal is to get all of this out here somehow. And that's why I chose this image, because I felt like it would be a really good illustration of that challenge. I've kind of got a dominant movement coming out like this. So when I have a movement element, I try to make my bridges agree with that. So instead of cutting across here, it's probably a better decision to try to get that to flow the same way that those flower petals are flowing. In some cases, I'm just going to have to break the edge of it, right? That's just a thing. So like in this case, I think I'm just going to have to break that into this. But as long as I have enough shading in here, it should read okay. And it's going to be the same thing here, probably. So I think out here, what I'm going to do is just go out here. And I'll come back with a Sharpie and I'll shade that in a little bit more clearly. So with this one, I think I'm going to connect here too. Let's see. This ought to connect with that probably. I kind of got myself in a fix here. Let's see. Connect those two. That seems logical. Then if I do that, let's do this. Let's connect the edge of this to that one there. Okay. So I've got a pretty good matrix happening in this area, right? I'm just going to do one last check before I start shading these areas in. Of course, I'll do this all the way around, okay? Is there anything, like as I'm following it, that looks like it doesn't have very many connections? This only has 2, so that's going to flap a lot, right? So I should find something or some way that I can connect that better. So I think giving it a 3rd right here is going to help. Okay. All right, I like that pretty well. Clean my brush though, because this is going to like get destroyed. My next step in this, then I'm going to let this dry a little bit. I'm going to go back in there and I'm going to take it all to black and white, right? Okay, so now I'm just going to go in here and start blackening these. So like in this case, I'm not going to include that shading. It's pretty light. And I'm seeing that only has 1 connection, so I'm probably going to have to come back to that later. I do want to clarify the tips of these flowers though, these petals. And in some cases I'll do stuff like, you know, I'll cut a little channel there just to create a little bit of description. I don't need a lot of description necessarily. So anything that I'm not shading in, I won't cut out. So that means that sometimes instead of like making something like making a bridge with my paint, I can just sort of like have a psychic bridge in my mind to understand, okay, I'll just leave that connection there because I have enough information. I'm gonna get the swirl involved, so I think what I'll do is I'll have kind of a significant line there and a significant line out here that comes from that, and then just like one little tiny thing here. I think that's going to help show that organic nature pretty well. Get a little bit of a contour line in there, a little bit of like a weird triangular kind of break in there, and that this offers a natural inlet here, or rather bridge. Back in here and hit this a little bit. I'm seeing that this only has 1 connection too, so it'd probably be a good idea for me to go back and that one, yeah, there's the one. Just gonna do something like that. That kind of agrees with the way the petal moves. Okay, so the idea is to have all this codified, right? And then when I'm ready to cut, I can begin cutting out my black. Now, one thing that I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to color code, right? So when you have your black and white elements, okay, that you have designed for the key plate, you're gonna want to have a good idea about where you're gonna wanna have color, okay? So like, say I want a lot of red in my flower only, okay? What I might do, actually I think it'd be really cool if I did red up to the inside part of the blossom. So just to kind of get a good idea for this, I'm going to take some colored pencils and I'm going to work out my color ideas on my master. Which of course, for you, it would be a lot better, I think, to have this all like on one piece of paper, have your composition completed. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just using a couple of different, compositional things that I pulled out. But we'll have a lot more to discuss in class if you have this really figured out ahead of time. So then what's it going to look like if I have some yellow in the middle of this, right? And sometimes this kind of helps you down the road make those decisions. That's going to have a dramatically different character than if I tried something else, right? Well, let's say maybe in order to get this to pop a lot from the negative space, what if I had like a lot of blue sort of explosive lines coming out from that, or maybe like a fade to where it's like real dark close to it and it just gets lighter as it comes away. And there are ways we can do that with the stencil, right? So you want to have these things kind of worked out. If you say, I don't know, wanted to assign certain colors to certain parts of the architecture, could be kind of interesting for me to go with like a blue section in this architectural spot here. Maybe alternate that to where this one's blue as well. What's it look like if I go red with this? Alternate red here. And then maybe it would be more dynamic if my spires moving up were yellow. And then let's say I want some secondary colors. So perhaps the very tip of this thing could be yellow with somewhat of an orange fade at the bottom kind of thing. So I can just take like a lighter red over the top, or I can take orange, right? That way I've got sort of this color enhancement situation. And then if I wanted more information in here as well, maybe instead of just keeping it black and white here, right? Maybe I can add another stencil to this, and I could actually painstakingly create a type matrix like this. Or, for the sake of argument, why not cut one out completely and then glue like a screen to that has a natural stencil type property, right? We'll get more into that advanced stuff a little bit later. But next step here for me is to find my master plate and get it cut. So I feel like I've got my key plate drawn up pretty well. I had to make a lot of decisions in here in terms of how to make it lighter as it goes across. And I may not cut all of those black spots out, just kind of depending. If they're really tiny, it maybe doesn't make sense, right? So I'll make a lot of decisions as I'm going when it comes to cutting. Now this flower, it's a little bit different story, right? There's a lot of intricate detail inside of here in areas that could fail pretty easily if I don't make sure that I've got them bridged well. So the strategy for this is going to be smarter to go in and carefully cut the delicate stuff and then move my way out, right? Because if I were to cut from the outside in, and make it to where, okay, yeah, I've got these like bridges that are coming from the outside and they're describing all that, but then I get closer and closer to the inside and I'm wanting to make delicate cuts. Well, it's going to be like pulling on and dependent upon the sort of filigree stuff that's happening out here. So I'm going to be more likely to like rip this up or make mistakes with that or inside just because it's not as strong. So it's always best to go from the most intricate, the most detailed parts of your design and then move out to those strongest, more simpler designs. So again, I'm cutting out my black. When you're doing this, and you have weird organic shapes in here, it's a good idea to think about cutting them as more regular shapes. Like that was kind of a complicated shape, right? Like this whole thing in here. I didn't cut that all in one solid kind of vectored shaped area. I cut it in chunks to make it easier for me, right? So I'm gonna go through just some of those. Like I'm gonna work this area out here. Like for me, this makes the most sense to kind of cut it like a, I don't know, cucumber type shape, something like that. And you can see that I'm using the tip of my blade, right? I see a lot of people who want to use the blade like this, thinking, oh, well, I've got more, blade working, but that doesn't really work, right? You get all your precision from the tip of the blade. Use the tip of the blade. Be precise with it. Curve your hand around. Pull it out in sections. When I have little delicate areas like this, I try to cut away from them because if I cut toward them, I'm going to be more inclined, or more likely rather, to make a mistake and cut through it. When I cut a small area like that, I cut the edges and then I use my fingernail to hold that so it doesn't bend and move on me. So now I'm going to go ahead and bring this channel up through here. If your blade gets dull, get rid of it, because a dull blade is going to make for a less precise cut. I always like to have a piece of really bright construction paper around or something so I can see what those marks look like. It's kind of hard on this green mat, but of course you will be cutting on a mat because you're not going to destroy my tables. It makes me unhappy. I'm kind of freestyling this one a little bit just because I hadn't worked that out 100%, but I've been doing this a while, so I'm pretty sure I know what I'm doing there. That's going to work out. Okay, so like what happens if I make a mistake, right? Well, I'm going to find a good spot that I can intentionally make a mistake. I'll have something fall out. I don't know if this is that spot though, because I have a swivel knife that I like to use a lot too, and that's pretty awesome for this, but it doesn't cut very deeply. So let's see here. How about this? What I'll do is I'll go ahead and just cut this out. I'm going to get up to this location here. And then I'm going to cut through here because that's black, right? So I'm going to bring this up into this marking here. Again, I'm holding that down so it doesn't go anywhere. So I've kind of caused myself to have a little bit of an issue here because like when I drew this, I made it so close. Like I don't have much of an island here. So let's say something happens and I accidentally cut that out, right? Whoops, I don't want to lose it. So I've cut that out on accident, or kind of manufactured an accident, as it were. Let's see. So it's not the end of the world if you make a mistake, and you're gonna make mistakes. So, be prepared for that idea. What I do whenever I make a mistake, and you can see that that's that other piece of paper on there, I try to arrange it back to where I had it. Then I just take a piece of tape, and you want masking tape for this because it's easier to cut. So I'm just going to make sure that it's in the position that I want it. Then I'm carefully going to place my masking tape over the top. I'm going to burnish it on, right? So that's not enough, right? That's not going to hold it together enough because I really only have like a little bit of adhesive sticking onto that. So it's going to be important that you do both sides. Now the masking tape repair is not going to be nearly as strong as not going to be nearly as strong as your mat. I keep wanting to say mat board, but it's not. It's tag board. But it can be used in a repair situation. So I'm just kind of trying to redefine that, how that connects so I can see better. Well, maybe instead of just one connection, I should have gone with 2 or 3. So I'm just going to take my Sharpie here and just kind of manufacture a few little connections in there. And yes, I'm kind of thinking backwards here now because before I was cutting out my black, but I needed something to see on top of this whiter masking tape better. So now I'm just going to go ahead and cut through my masking tape really well. And again, that's going to be a delicate spot. So there's some things that we can do to make those little, so I was like really gingerly when I cut that, right? I didn't want to like push too hard. Doesn't take much to cut that. So we could do some things to strengthen that. Like we could like lightly paint a little bit of matte medium over it after I've got my whole thing done, and that'll strengthen it. The main thing is if you do have a mistake, like I said earlier, you will probably have some mistakes. You'll make them. Happens. We're humans. Save that piece that fell out, right? That's really important. If you don't save the piece, then we can take another piece of tag board. We can manufacture something like that. But it's just a lot easier if you have the original piece. So now what I need to do is be mindful about like actually cutting this out of those areas that they should be cut out of, right? So I might have to go back in there and redefine. Like I can kind of see it, so I'm just going to shade back in where I know I need that dark area. I don't want to have to do this blind, so to speak. Go kind of make the decision to just cut that out. I'm just going to leave this little guy here. Have that guy be like, maybe that's the end of that one there. Blacken that out. Let's see, I'm trying to remember. I think I need, seems that I probably need to have more than just that one in there. So I'm gonna allow this bridge and allow that to come through here. So then what I'm going to do is just change this to cut like so. And you'll see me rotate this often, right? It's always best to be strategic about how you're cutting. Do not force your hand to do something that is ergonomically in disagreement with what you're trying to do. It's so much easier if you use the natural curvature of your hand to help you. Now, of course, like just because you've designed this thing this way, or however you design your key plate, it doesn't mean you can't add more information later, right? You might decide after you've got most of this stuff cut that you're like, I don't know, I think I'd like to add more stuff, like, I don't know, some birds in the sky or something, or maybe some textures or whatever. Just feel free. It's not like you're stuck to that iteration. Ooh. So this is a good thing to happen. This is one of those issues that happens whenever you glue your stuff down with a glue stick. So Again, that's kind of a pitfall when it comes to this method. You've got a choice to either glue it back on or, hope that you understand the information well enough that you don't have to. And I'm trying to be really faithful to the edge of my border here. I don't want to have cuts out to the border. I want the border to be clean. The border needs to stop out. All right, I'm going to drop this underneath and see if I have something a little bit better there. Yeah, looks like it's going to work. So that's corrections, right? Now I'll continue through this area. I'll cut this as detailed as I can, yet strong. I'll work my way out to the edges, and then I think probably the best strategy with this one would be to start with my smaller cuts while it's sturdy, and then move into the bigger cuts, right? Because those bigger cuts are going to open up the tag board to where they're not going to hold the whole thing very well. It might be really attractive to you to cut these out first because they're going to be like, oh, it's a lot of work. That happens very quickly, but strategically it's better. It's really better to make sure that you've got the smaller cuts, the more detailed cuts before you go to the big ones. All right, so I'll see you after I get this cut.